Vayavo b'nei Yisrael kolo Edo. The Bnei Yisrael, the entire Edo, the entire congregation. What does that mean? Kolo Edo means the whole congregation was Bnei Yisrael. We'll see in a moment. The Ohr HaChaim points out, whenever the Jews don't behave in conformance with the Torah and they become rebellious, they're referred to as Am, the people. Bnei Yisrael is an appellation, which means where they're spiritually sound and they're fully invested in the will of Hashem. When it says Am Bnei Yisrael, the people, Bnei Yisrael, means they're basically in good form, but there's some who are actually failing. But here the Torah says Bnei Yisrael. This is the ultimate level. They're all spiritually sound, every one of them. So he explains over here why over here are they referred to as Bnei Yisrael and not Am Bnei Yisrael. V'yo Bnei Yisrael kol Edo midbatzin b'chodesh harishon. They came to the Tzin Desert the first month. Vayeshev Om b'Kodesh, and they dwelt in Kodesh. V'atomish Miriam, and Miriam passed away there. V'tikovisham, and she was buried immediately after she passed away. We'll see in a moment. Chazal tell us she wasn't eulogized. Could you imagine a woman of Miriam's dimension and distinction, being firstly, even if she was an ordinary person, just being the sister of Moshe and Aaron, being the midwife in Egypt, together with her mother Yocheved, she's poor. When we speak about the midwives, Shifra was Yocheved, the mother, Pua was Miriam. Miriam initially had prophesied that her mother was going to give birth to the Redeemer of Israel. Miriam was the one initially who waited to see what was going to happen with Moshe Rabbeinu, whether he was going to drown when his mother put him in the basket, put him in the Nile. She sang the song of the sea with the women, and yet, when she passed away, she wasn't eulogized. In addition, we'll see in a moment, it was in her merit that we had the bear, the wellspring, traveled with us for 40 years. This is the 40th year. So a woman of the past and the present, in terms of what she represented, literally the survival of the Jewish people, she passes away, she's buried, and we no longer talk about who she is, what she is. A background, accomplishments, nothing. So it's a little, difficult to understand. How is it possible? This is Kol Edo. This is where that there's such an advanced level that none of them have any spiritual blind spots, and yet somehow they missed it. Discuss it in a moment. So firstly, Rashi over here cites the Chazal, Kol Edo, Edo Shlema. Here the congregation was considered fully intact, as they should be. Shefgar Mesu, Mesi Midbar, Ve'edu Papishu L'chaim. All those that it was decreed and they were condemned to die over the 40-year period, the past generation passed away. This is the new generation that's worthy to go into Eretz Yisrael. This is the new, that's Kol Edo. But Tomisha Miriam, Lama Nischa Parshas Misas Miriam, the Parshas Paraduma. What is to juxtapose the passing of Miriam to the portion of the Paraduma? Loma loch ma korbanos mechaprin. Just as a korban atones, reinstates a person. Avmis sadik mechaperes. That's the juxtaposition. As the Paraduma, which is classified as a korban, atones, the mis sadikim also atones. When the tzaddik passes away, this kapora. Now, what does this mean? Firstly, the paraduma is not a korban that's brought in the in the Beis Hamikdash or in the Mishkan. It was something that was done on Har HaMishkan, Har HaZeisim. They were slaughtered there, and they would sprinkle the blood, and they would towards Yerushalayim. And not only that, one doesn't say vidui. And but yet we say this is called mechaperes. What's mechaperes? So as we discussed yesterday, from Moshe Darshan, that the only way you can be relieved from the contamination of the dead is only first if you undergo the ritual of the paraduma. That somehow addresses that impurity, which is actually an impediment to one's spirituality. That itself establishes and identifies who we are. Who are we? We have a handicap. We're all handicapped with the sin of the Eitz Hadas. Due to the Chet Egel, we reverted back to post-sin. That's what the Paraduma represents. And despite that, you're able to be relieved from the Chet Egel with the Paraduma. So although it's not the conventional Kapora atonement, because we sinned, it has nothing to do with we at the moment that we sinned. But since we're part of the humanity that has the effect of that sin, of Adam Rishon, where initially we really were able to pull ourselves out of that. Because when at Sinai for 40 days until the Chet Egel, we reverted back to pre-sin. So as a result of the Chet Egel, which was our failing, we went post-sin. So the Paradum addresses the whole issue of what Chil Hashem. All the Chil Hashem from Adam till the end of time is only as a result of what? Of the Eitz Hadas. The reason why we're lacking clarity or subject to the influences of the evil inclination is only because of the Eitz Hadas, and we nearly succeeded to extricate ourselves from that, but we failed with Chet Egel. So there's a kapora aspect of the paraduma. That's what it is. It makes us worthy, gives us a certain level of worthiness that despite that, we're able to relieve ourselves from this level, from the consequence of that, which is tumah, which is the contamination of the dead. There are many things we're not worthy of, but the merit of the tzaddik, Hashem gives us a level of worthiness. That's meaning the tzaddik's mechaper alador. We should be denied certain levels of siyata d'shmaya. But the reason why Hashem doesn't deny us those levels of siyata d'shmaya, allows us to have relevance to spiritual growth, is the merit of the tzaddik. That's what it is. Therefore, this is the aspect of what? Of the tzaddik, the passing of the tzaddik to be juxtaposed to the paraduma. There's an Orach Chaim HaKadosh in one location. He says, any difficulty one has in the study of Torah, it's due to, he's in Kabbalistic terms, to the klipos. Klip is always the nether forces. That because we're entombed and we have impediments due to our level of behavior, and we don't do sufficient tshuva, we're not worthy of that siyata d'shmaya, because the nether forces are attached to us, are associated with us. But the greater the tzaddik is, because he's able to relieve himself of those nether forces, he's able to have greater levels of clarity. That's what it is. The tumah represents the nether force. You're associated with that nether force. The paraduma removes that impediment, and as a result of that, we have greater level of clarity. So that's the mechaperes. The mis tzaddik is mechaperes. Now the question is why. I once mentioned the name of the Chazon Ish. There was a story. Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, Zecher Tzadik Levrocho, who was the father-in-law of Rav Aaron Kotler, originally was in Slutsk. It was a city in Lithuania, or Latvia. It was called Slutsk. And he had a yeshiva in Slutsk. And originally he was a yeshiva in Slobodka. Isizam was Rosh in Slobodka. He left Slobodka. That's where all the great Lithuanian Torah sages came from in Europe. That's the Alt of Slobodka. He was the one who mentored these people. So he went off to become the chief rabbi of Slutsk, and he had yeshiva in Slutsk. And eventually he emigrated to Palestine. We talk about in the 20s. And he had a yeshiva there. He was the yeshiva. There was a yeshiva. It still exists till today. It's called Eitz Chaim. And he was the yeshiva, and he was very old. And he was known as the Zakan Ador, the elder Rosh Yeshiva of the generation. And he was an exceptional tzaddik, Rabbi Zalman Meltzer. And when the state of Israel was founded, if you read a little Jewish history, people who sing Hatikva, they know this history. And the ones who used to come into Israel and they sang Havin the Gila on the plane, they got all excited. They should know this history. Okay, being a little facetious over here, that the moment the state of Israel was declared in the UN, all the Arab armies attacked Israel. And Yerushalayim was under bombardment. Rabbi Zalman was already in his mid-80s, and he was wounded with shrapnel. And he had a leg wound. It wasn't life-threatening. But you think a man of his spiritual dimension and his level of influence on the Klal Yisrael in terms of mitzvahs and what he represented, he should somehow be protected from this kind of mishap, incident, this accident. But he was wounded. He had a leg wound with shrapnel, and he had to be treated. So they went to the Chazon Ish to ask him, how's it possible, a man of this special spiritual dimension, that he himself should be subject, he should have merited some kind of divine protection, not to be wounded. So the Chazon Ish says, this is the way it works. And this the Ramchal says, what is Midas Adin? Midas Adin, the attribute of justice is, nobody has a perfect record. Every one of us has a flawed record. As Shlomo says in Koheles, there's no perfect tzaddik. Every tzaddik that exists, he has some degree of sin. However, but since the majority of his accomplishments are positive, as the Rambam says, Rov Zochis, the classification of a person's tzaddik. That's tzaddik. But even if one's record is not the majority, if Hashem does not allow Sodom to audit the record, which is called prosecution, Midas HaRachmim, the attribute of Rachmim is in place. But the moment the balance is off balance of Klal Yisrael, Sodom comes to Hashem and says, you've pushed me off enough times. Based on the record, they have to be punished. Can't remain silent any longer. And the times where Hashem says, you're right, and there has to be suffering, casualties, and all kinds of terrible things. So what does Hashem do? Hashem allows Satan to take so many lives, or to allow so much suffering to come about, to atone for those sins of Klal Yisrael. We're talking about communal responsibility. So even the tzaddik sometimes is affected. But how does it work? So he says, let's say, and there's a Gemara in Psochim, that when the sea closed on the Egyptian army, we find that the Jews were concerned that maybe the Egyptians did not drown. They were coming around the other side. And ultimately, they're going to be attacked. So Moshe Rabbeinu said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, allow the sea to spit out the remains of the Egyptians on the seashore, that the Jews should see that they all drowned when the sea came down on them. And that's when they sang Doz Yoshir. And that's when we had the spoils of the sea. We had when they saw the Egyptians, that they were Mesu Asvasayam, that the remains were on the seashore, and all the chariots with all the wealth came out, they sang the Shira. Now, they're angels that are created to oversee existence. And there's an angel called Sarayam. the Sar, the minister of the ocean. The Sarayam says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but if all these remains are in the sea, it's meant to be, they should be consumed by the ocean. By you asking me to spit them out, I'm being denied my function. That's my responsibility, that they should remain in the sea and be food for the fish or whatever fish are there. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm going to make it up to you in the future. In the war of Sisera, the story of Devorah and Barak, when they went to war, it says Nachal Kishon came up, swept them away, and swept in the whole army into Nachal Kishon. So that was to compensate for the remains of the Egyptians that the sea did not swallow up. So therefore, God had to make it up to the sea. This is Gemara Pesachim. So Satan comes, he says, I want my pound of flesh. The Jews deserved. Until a certain point, Hashem keeps pushing off the Satan. I don't want you to prosecute my children. I don't want to hear about it. But if it comes to a point where Hashem can't push him off any longer, because the negative side is so heavily balanced to negative, Hashem has to allow the Satan to be prosecuting the record. So Satan comes to Hashem and says, to cover this liability, we need 100,000 casualties. So what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? Hashem says, we're going to allow the tzaddik to be wounded, to incur this type of wound. And Rabbi Zalman Meltzer is wounded. He has this shrapnel in his leg. Something comes back to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says, it's not enough. We need another 100,000 Jews, casualties. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Satan, I've allowed you to hurt my Ben Yochid, my most special child, my only child, who's my prince. And after he's wounded, you want an additional 100,000 Jews? He throws him out on his head. This is the Chazon Ish. He drives him out. He says, I don't want to hear it. You've taken sufficiently. We've suffered enough that I allowed you. So he said that Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, incurring this wound, saved 100,000 lives. That's what the Chazon Ish said. That's the tzaddik is mechaper lador. When Hashem takes a tzaddik, maybe 1 million Jews chas v'shalom should have died, but because of the innate value of the tzaddik, it's the equivalent of 1 million Jews. Therefore, it solves the Satan. Satan says it's not enough. Hashem says, Satan, I've heard enough. You've taken enough. I've heard enough. And the moment the audit stops, the prosecution stops, Midas HaRachman is reinstated. This is the concept of tzaddikim mechaper ma'ador. The tzaddik atones for the generation because there's a communal responsibility. So, but the tzaddik being taken resets the balance to a degree that Satan cannot prosecute any longer. And as a result of that, that's why Midas HaRachman is reinstated. The explanation I'm giving is the Ramchal. This is how the Ramchal explains it. It's the same thing. What do we merit? Certain levels of clarity despite the influence of the world. To be able to survive in this world with all the overwhelming negative influences, where everything is the antithesis of what we are. I mean, how do you survive it? Could you imagine living on an island and every day there's a tidal wave and a tsunami covering the island and it's not swept away? And you survive. And you continue living as if the tsunami never came, as if the tidal wave never hit the island. We in this world, to be an observant Jew, to be a maimon, and not be consumed with all the perversions of the world, to be swept away, it's a miracle. It's a miracle. It's only due to Siyata Dishmaya, the special divine intervention that creates this protective barrier that despite everything, there's a continuous infusion of clarity, and therefore we're able to stay the course for that reason. Without that, it's impossible. That's tzaddikim mechaper ma'ador. You have tzaddikim every generation. They're lamed vav tzaddikim nistorim. The 36 tzaddikim, which are hidden tzaddikim, you don't even know who they are. In their merit, the world stands. If not for them generating that level of spirituality, there's not sufficient worthiness that Hashem should continue maintaining this existence. That's the concept also of tzaddikim mechaperim. They address that shortcoming As a result of that, the Sultan's prosecution is silenced. And as a result of that, we merit levels of clarity. Certain levels of siyat d'shmai become available to us, which would not be because we'd have the worthiness. Tuma is a blockage. That represents the klipa. That's the impurity as a result of the chet of Adam Rishon, or the egel. That's the reason why the Torah juxtaposes Misas Miriam, the passing of Miriam, to the Paraduma. There's no fact the Vilna Gaon, although we're never going to be relieved of the impurity of Tumas mess, the contamination of dead, until we have the Paraduma, which is only to come about with the Bias Mashiach. When Mashiach comes, that's going to be the next Paraduma, to purify the Jewish people, to be able to bring karbonos, because as long as you have that impurity, we can't be relieved of it. The Vilna Gaon, although we're all contaminated, but every time we go to a cemetery or expose ourselves to that kind of contamination, it intensifies that contamination. The Vilna Gaon, the only time he allowed himself to be contaminated was when his parents passed away. And because it's a mitzvah that a person has to contaminate himself to the severed relatives, so when his mother and father passed away, he went to the cemetery. He would only allow him, he put his hands over the remains of his parents, because if you put your hand directly over it, that's called oil. And he became contaminated. And he went to the cemetery, would not allow himself to be exposed to any other of the graves, because this is an obligation, regardless of the consequence of that tumah. He's obligated to contaminate himself. Otherwise, he was careful not. He never went to a cemetery, the Vilna Gaon, because the Vilna Gaon had a level of siyat d'shmai of clarity, and he felt going to a cemetery, allow himself to be contaminated, that would somehow detract and infringe on the availability of the siyat d'shmai which he had. That was the Vilna Gaon. In existence, there has to be a balance. There's a balance of good and evil. There has to be a representation of evil, which is called koach hatuma, which is represented by the nether forces. That is a representation of nether forces. When you have a choice between good and evil, that it's out there and that was subject to temptation, that's the representation of nether forces. There has to be an equal balance. For instance, he explains, the Gemara tells us, the person should not go out by himself at nighttime. In this week's parsha, when we speak about the famous Ramban, not here, it's in Achrei Mos, the Sorla Zozel, the goat that was thrown down the mountainside, which atoned for all the sins of the Jewish people. Where was it thrown down? In the desert. The desert is the location, because since it's not a community, doesn't exist in the desert, Hashem designated that's the location of nether forces. Because if the nether forces would be allowed to infiltrate into a community where people live, people would not survive. They would not survive. They'd be consumed and be harmed by these nether forces. At one time, they were shading demons. Demons is not some kind of a myth. Demons is a reality. Where do you have demons? In the desert, you have demons. Because that's the place of nether forces. You throw the goat, the Ramban speaks about this in length over there, that since the nether forces, the Satan, that's the location of the Satan. Satan is in the desert. And you go and over there he explains, it's like we want to distract the Satan that he should not prosecute the Jewish people on the Day of Atonement. Yom Kippur was the ultimate day of Rachmim, of forgiveness. We want to silence him that he should not. Rosh Hashanah, we have the shofar that silences him. On Yom Kippur, what do we have? It's the greatest day of mercy. So by giving him the Sorla Zozel, acknowledging him, but it's not a korban. It's not a korban. It's done. You throw it down the mountainside. It's not done by a Kohen. But somehow it addresses the Satan, and the location where the Satan is in the desert. Because that is the location of all the nether forces. Every morning at Amor HaShachar, at dawn, and especially sunrise, it's like you have smog and you have a wind coming in and just sweeps out the smog and all the impurities in the air. At sunrise, HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes and cleanses existence from the nether forces, and he sweeps them into a location which people are not associated with. Because otherwise, but the nighttime period, and that's the reason why there's a whole question of halacha. If a person stays up all night, doesn't sleep, and morning comes, do you have to ritualize your hands, what we call negel vasa? Is there a ruach tumah on your hands? Is a question. And it's unresolved, therefore, in the morning, if you stay up all night, Shavuos night, even if you didn't sleep, you wash your hands like you wash your hands as if you slept, because there's a question, does sleep cause the impurity to come to your hands? Or it's the nighttime? That causes that impurity. So according to the opinion, but why the nighttime? Because the nighttime is a period of impurity. That's what it is. The reason why, night is referred to as Midas Adin. A korban, the actual ritual, what's the main ritual of a korban? What we call the Dalet Avodos, the slaughtering, the receiving of the blood, the transporting of the blood, and the sprinkling of the blood. That's the kapara. Kapara is only until sundown. Because the concept of kapara, korban, is Midas Arachim. Once we go into the nighttime period, it's Midas Adin. It's the time of the nether forces. Therefore, the only thing you do at nighttime is sacrifice the animal, burn the animal. But the actual ritual which brings kapara, that's only during the daytime, not the nighttime period. For the same reason. That's what. So therefore, as a result of this, and it's interesting, the Gemara tells us. The Rambam rules this in Hilchos Talmud Torah, that if a person has a choice to study during the daytime or nighttime, the nighttime is a better time to study. Why? Because Yirmiyah Navi, who wrote Eicham, and when the Klal Yisrael were going after destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the first Beis Hamikdash, they're going to exit to Bavel. He says over there, Kumi Roni Balaylo. This is the Rambam's words. Kumi, supposedly Eicham, rise and sing out in the nighttime. And the Rambam says, Ein Rina Ela Torah. What is the song of the Jewish people? Torah. That's our song. That's Rina. Ein Rina Ela Torah. And what does Yirmiyah say? At nighttime, Kumi Roni Balaylo. You should rise and engage in that song. Because Torah itself is, despite the period of time, is so mega in terms of its innate value, it could spell the Midas Adin. It could count the Midas Adin, because Torah itself is Midas Adin, as we discussed. Right? Emes Kenev Al Timkor. Posuk Mishlei. Acquire truth, don't sell it. Emes is what? That's din. That's absolute truth. There's no wiggle room. So when you engage in din, which represents the ultimate kedusha, that dispels whatever that din is, whatever those nether forces are. And many Gemara say that a person has Torah, it protects you from Gehenna. It wards off all that level of prosecution, even if a person dies. He's protected from a more extreme level of justice because he has Torah.
So the juxtaposition of Miriam's death to the Paraduma.
Regarding on the festivals, what do we say? Right? You chose us of all the nations. You loved us, you desired us. The you exalted us, you elevated it from all the nations. At Sinai, you sanctified us with the mitzvos. Okay? So when were we sanctified with mitzvos? At Sinai. When we do a mitzvah, what is the nusach? What is the text of the bracha? Asher kitshonu b'mitzvosov. It's Ivanu. You sanctified us with your mitzvos, and you commanded us, lo niach tefillin, l'sati b'tzitz, whatever the bracha may be. Right? Al netilas luv, but always the text is Asher kitshon mitzvah. right? That's that you've sanctified us with, that's it, but yet every Shabbos and every Yom Tov, when we supplicate Hashem before the Ritzei, what do we say to Hashem? Sanctify us with our mitzvah, with your mitzvahs, and give us our share portion in the Torah. And what are we asking? Hashem already sanctified us with the mitzvahs at Sinai. And every time we say a bracha relating to a mitzvah, Hashem kidshan mitzvah. You've sanctified us with your mitzvahs. So why are we asking every Shabbos and Yom Tov, kachin mitzvah v'seichel ken mitzvah? Just a simple question. Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, writes that when a person sins and you reach a level of unworthiness, how does Hashem see that person? Meshukots sonui, meshukots u'metuav. Those are Rambam's words. You're despised by God. You're meshukots, from the word sheketz, like a rodent, and you're abominable in God's eyes. That's the way he sees that person. And when you do a mitzvah, you know what he does to the mitzvah? He shreds it and throws it back in your face. God says, I'm not interested in your mitzvah. After the person does tshuva, what is the result of that reinstatement? Of the nechmod v'yokor. You're beloved, you're precious, and very special. And even before you do the mitzvah, Hashem already is embracing you, even before you do the mitzvah. That's the contrast pre-tshuva and after tshuva. Now, what's our relevance to Hashem? The only connector to Hashem is if we establish a common out, Hashem is holy. Hashem ato kodosh shimcho kodosh. God is holy, your name is holy, and we have innateness of holiness. But what creates the connection? Hashem gave us mitzvahs to sanctify ourselves, and as a result of that, we have relevance to be able to attach ourselves to Hashem, to have that relationship. Whatever Hashem says, I'm not interested in the relationship. And he takes the mitzvah, he throws it back at you. That is the catalyst that attaches us. But Hashem says he keeps you at arm's length. You never attach. The source of Kedusha is, it allows you to attach. If you attach to the source of Kedusha, you become Kadosh. But if he doesn't allow that connection, you never assume Kedusha. So you have to be worthy, as the Rambam says. If you're not worthy, he throws it back at you. If you're worthy, he allows you to connect. How do you connect? Through the mitzvah. So at Sinai, he gave us the potential that if we utilize the system, we're able to connect him and achieve holiness, because we're attaching us